Committee will come to order. Without objection, the gentleman from Minnesota, Pete Stauber, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Brad Finstad, are authorized to participate in the hearing and ask questions. The Ways and Means Committee is in Kimball, Minnesota for our 5th hearing in local communities to hear directly from America's farmers, ranchers, and mining communities about how America's trade policies affect their daily lives and what Congress can do to make trade work better for their families. America is only 6%. America is only 6% of the world's landmass, and we make up just 4% of the global population. Yet America's farmers are so productive that they do more than anyone else to feed the world. Opening new markets for farmers and ranchers to export more products is critical to their survival. We are blessed not only with productive farmland, but also with a wealth of natural resources. Nowhere is that clearer than Minnesota, which has one of the nation's largest cobalt reserves, like my home state of Missouri. Yet while America currently produces no refined cobalt, China continues to expand its grip on this critical mineral, currently producing 72% of the world's supply. In fact, an investment firm of which Hunter Biden, the president's son, was a founding member, helped facilitate a Chinese company's purchase of one of the world's richest cobalt mines located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. On top of that, the administration made it harder to produce important metals in America last year when it canceled two federal hard rock mineral leases to produce copper, nickel, and other precious metals here in Minnesota. Instead of reducing America's near total dependence on China for practically every critical mineral, the Biden administration has made policy choices that double down on this reliance. While shutting down critical mineral production here, the Biden administration goes around Congress to sign dubious trade agreements that keep America dependent on foreign supply chains. Billions of American tax dollars are going to the Chinese Communist Party to build electric vehicles, while Americans are blocked from mining and refining the components required to build those same vehicles. Right now, farmers are being hurt because trading partners are not abiding by their commitments. Mexico's unscientific ban on American corn, China failing to meet its commitment to purchase more American agriculture products, or Canada blocking American dairy are just a few examples. All our trading partners must be held accountable. Non-tariff barriers exist against U.S. ag exports across the globe and only serve to harm the very farmers represented here today. The Ways and Means Committee will continue to urge the Biden administration to enforce USMCA and the Phase 1 agreement and tear down unfair trade barriers. American farmers are the best in the world and need new markets to sell their crops. The Biden administration must build on USMCA and work with other countries to open these new markets. We know, just to name a few, there are today barriers to market access for U.S. beef, pork, and poultry, including in the United Kingdom, Taiwan, and other parts of Asia. The EU continues to even try to own the market for generic cheeses like Parmesan and Feta by trying to limit access for U.S. dairy products. Given a level playing field, I know that our farmers can compete and win against any competitor. Fake trade agreements that lack the force of law, like those that the administration has been pursuing, set up American farmers and miners for financial ruin. The Constitution gives Congress authority over trade because we are the branch closest to the people who are impacted most by our trade policies. There is no substitute for enforceable, congressional-approved trade agreements for the long-term prosperity of our farmers. Congress will continue to assert its authority over trade given to us in Article 1 of the Constitution, and we will use this authority to protect the interest of family farmers and ranchers on the world stage. I'm glad we are joined today by our witnesses who represent America's farmers and ranchers, including dairy farmers and our host, Schiefelbein Farms, as well as an expert in critical minerals. This committee wants to hear from everyone here today as well. There will be notebooks passed out in the audience for everyone to share with us your concerns and ideas. We will enter those into the official hearing record and take those back with us to Washington as we consider how to protect farmers and secure our supply chains. I want to thank our witnesses for taking the time away from your farms and your families and your work to share your stories of trade in America. I'm now pleased to recognize the gentle lady from California, Ms. Sanchez, for her opening statement.
Good morning to members of the committee and our witnesses, and thank you for joining us in Kimball, Minnesota for today's trade hearing on agriculture and critical supply chains. Our farmers, miners, engineers, and scientists here in Minnesota and across the country evoke the possibilities, progress, and potential that the American dream can offer. As a member of this committee and as a member of the Trade Subcommittee, I recognize the crucial role that trade plays in providing livelihoods for American farmers and workers employed in the food industry. Across the country, from California to Wisconsin, Iowa to South Dakota, the agricultural sector's workforce has become largely dependent on migrant and seasonal workers. Farm workers often suffer poor working conditions and a complicated visa process. And I know that that issue is not only a challenge for farm workers, but also for those who employ them. Over the past year, my office has met with farm groups advocating for reforms to our immigration laws to allow more farmers to work here legally and greater market access for their goods and services. New market opportunities for American agriculture doesn't just translate into economic gains for farmers and their families here, but it also provides greater choices in global consumer goods and reduces food insecurity in our partner countries. The bottom line is that our farmers do not just feed us, they help feed the world, and their impact reaches far beyond just our shores. To ensure our farmers and workers benefit from the trade agreements Congress has approved, the United States must make sure that our trading partners are living up to the commitments that they've made in these agreements. Committee Democrats played a critical role in the renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. And I just want to remind all of the members on this committee that as a result of our efforts, the trade agreement we have with two of our closest trading partners now includes enforceable provisions. Those were provisions that we fought very hard to make sure were inserted into that agreement. The Biden administration has used the tools Congress granted to enforce the agreement so that our workers and farmers can compete on a level playing field. In my home state of California, our farmers know what it means to play a critical role in feeding the nation. Farmers in California grow over 400 different crops, making it the state and the country's largest producer and exporter. However, the sheer scale of production in the United States has also contributed to our current climate crisis. Despite the cutting-edge approaches that farmers across the country are utilizing, including here in Minnesota, the sector is still responsible for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide. In both the agriculture and critical mineral sectors, we face some of our greatest challenges to date. How do we enhance and increase sustainable environmental practices as we work to keep domestic production in both sectors strong? And it doesn't have to be an either-or proposition. It is a matter of balance. Scaling up supply to meet demand without ensuring companies meet environmental regulations and governments do their part to protect biodiversity could result in more environmental disasters. These disasters even pose a great threat to critical mineral supplies themselves. California is home to one of the largest untapped lithium reserves in the world, close to the Salton Sea. Experts have likened it to another gold rush, as these reserves could power nearly 100,000 homes. This critical mineral is also essential for making EV batteries. Last year, House Democrats successfully prioritized domestic sourcing of critical minerals like lithium for EV batteries in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's why companies are vying to extract and begin commercial production in the Salton Sea. Their intent is to prove that they can pull lithium out of 600-degree brine in a way that's more environmentally friendly than any other country leading lithium production today. While the technology is unproven so far, I'm hopeful that this carbon-free geothermal energy, which avoids current environmentally degrading mining techniques, will push the industry into the 21st century. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to learn more about how Congress and this committee can continue to make our supply chains more resilient and support these key industries and the workers in them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. I am pleased to introduce the young lady who brought us all the way to Minnesota, Ms. Michelle Fischbach, the proud member of the Ways and Means Committee. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the chair for coming out to Kimball. And I just want to say to all of the members, welcome to Kimball. And we are so glad that you are here to see our beautiful state and hear from the impressive panel we've put together. And I do want to say thank you so much to Don and to Frosty and to the whole Scheffelbein family for hosting us. And I know that Big Frank is here in spirit, and he would be thrilled to have us here. And so we will think about him today, too. And I just, I am so excited that they are out here because they really do. It is important that we get out on the road and hear from everybody. And this is our fifth, I believe you said, our fifth committee hearing on the road. And so I'm excited to have them here so that they understand better about what's going on here in Kimball and around our district. The Land O'Lakes is a top 5 agriculture producer in the country and a leader in developing market access for the crops we grow. We also have mineral deposits that have helped build the national highway system and win world wars. Our state is well positioned to build our future with what lies beneath our feet. Through this committee, Congress is pushing for more aggressive trade agenda, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for your leadership and for holding the hearing and for your continued work in listening to the members of the communities. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to the discussion and working towards our shared goals. And before I yield back, I do have several items that we have in written testimony that was presented to us that, without objection, I would like to enter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Minnesota as well, Mr. Stauber, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for joining us today. And to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, welcome to the great state of Minnesota. As you will hear from our expert witnesses, we are not flyover country. I want to thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing to evaluate the impact of trade policies on the lives of so many Americans, particularly here in our great state of Minnesota. The trade of agricultural goods and minerals is so important to the future of our country. We have a rich 140-year history of mining in the Iron Range located in northeastern Minnesota. Mining is our past, our present, and our future. It was the miners on the Iron Range that supplied the iron that built the ships, the tanks, and the weapons for Americans and our allied forces during the Second World War. Today, over 80% of the steel made in this country comes from the taconite mined in northeastern Minnesota. Now, as the demand for critical minerals increases every day, Northeast Minnesota has an incredible opportunity to make the United States a leader in the critical mineral mining space. But certain leaders and policymakers lack the will to make that happen, forcing this country, the United States, to instead rely on global supply chains controlled by communist China, increasing our trade imbalance and threatening our national security. I look forward to discussing these challenges and opportunities this afternoon. And again, I want to thank you for allowing us to testify and be waived on the committee, and I look forward to the remainder of the hearing, and I yield back.
It's always great to have other members come to the best committee in Congress. So pleased to recognize the other gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Finstad.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal, for inviting me to join this important field hearing today. And I just want to say welcome to Minnesota. And I would ask all members just to take a quick second and smell in this beautiful smell of farm country. That's the smell of money. That's the smell of opportunity. And we're just really thankful that you're all here taking time to engage in this important conversation today. I'm a proud fourth-generation farmer from southern Minnesota and just so happy to be raising the fifth. And I understand the importance of a robust trade agenda for farm country. American farmers and ranchers efficiently produce the safest and most affordable fuel and food supply in the world. Importantly, opening and expanding markets has direct value for our farmers in rural communities, as well as consumers around the globe, who purchase more than 20% of U.S. ag production. Food and farm security is national security, and we must ensure America remains the breadbasket for the world. So I want to say thank you to our witnesses for being here today, for all of the great experiences that you bring to this table. I look around this table and I see lifelong friends and great advocates for Minnesota farmers, so thank you. I look forward to hearing from you about how we can carve a pathway forward while ensuring agriculture is at the table in every trade conversation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to welcome each of our witnesses for today's hearing. With us today are Mr. Don Schiefelbein, a cattle producer, an owner and operator of Schiefelbein Farms, and the host of the hearing, Tom Bach, a Minnesota minerals expert and a former state Senate Democrat leader, Carolyn Olson, owner and operator of Fairview Farm and vice president of the Minnesota Farm Bureau, Brad Vold, owner and operator of Dorich Dairy, and Gary Werdish, president of the Minnesota Farmers Union. You each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral arguments, and we'll begin with Mr. Schiefelbein.
Chairman Smith and members of the committee, thank you for coming to rural America to see firsthand from farmers and ranchers who feed America and the world. Your decision to have these hearings right here in farm country gives me great hope that our government is still a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So thank you. It is an honor to host this hearing at our family farm right here in our sale barn. Like most farmers and ranchers, this is an all-family farm. Started by my parents in 1955, Big Frank's vision and tenacity enabled the farm to grow as our family grew, and boy did it grow. Grandma Frosty, who is sitting over here to my left, taught us that to be successful, you need God and family to be the centerpiece of a successful operation. Thank you, Grandma Frosty. Our family farm consists of not one brother, not two, not three, but 7 brothers working alongside of our wives with our 32 children, their spouses, their 35-plus children. Guys, we're a good Catholic family. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts on agricultural trade and the future of family farming. Today's modern farming and ranching community is the very reason that less than 2% of our population feeds the United States and much of the world. The ability of ranchers and farmers to focus on efficiency is the reason that we can successfully feed so many with so few. I hope you had a chance to see a glimpse of progress by viewing the tractors on display. You will quickly realize our ability to efficiently farm has improved dramatically. During my 56 years, our precious soil yielded 75 bushels of corn per acre as a youngster. Today, those yields of yesteryear seem laughable. Thanks to modern practices where precision agriculture fertilizes the ground, soil is minimally tilled, and new genes have been utilized, our soil now produces over 200 bushels of corn per acre. 300% increase. Amazing. On the cattle side of our operation, it has been equally remarkable. The cattle we raised back in the early 1970s were harvested 1,000 pounds at over 2 years of age. Thanks to a laser-like focus on genetic improvement, using God's precious resources wisely, Today, we harvest our cattle weighing 1,350 pounds and just 13 months of age. In other words, we're now harvesting 350 more pounds of beef per animal and doing so in half the time. The U.S. produces 18% of the world's beef with just 6% of the world's cattle. U.S. cattle production accounts for just 2% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, resulting in the lowest greenhouse gas intensity in the world. The ability of agriculture to produce more with less is one of the most important factors in the development of this great nation. When so few can produce so much, it allows the 98% of our population to work every day to make our lives better. However, having fewer people engaged in agriculture is a double-edged sword. Today, most Americans are now 3 generations removed from the farm. Many consumers don't know where their food comes from. In fact, if you ask young Americans where their food comes from, the number one answer is the grocery store. That is why I'm so delighted that you have come, this important committee has come and made the effort to hear directly from us. There will be individuals that try to persuade you to include bad agricultural policies. Prop 12 from California is a perfect example of people 3 generations removed from agriculture dictating how livestock should be raised. This short-sighted legislation not only hurts the manner in which livestock are raised, but will substantially increase the cost of food. As I'm sure each of you is aware, increasing food cost is the single most painful tax you can place on the poor people of this country and the world. I urge you, in your incredible influence, to be mindful of the impact of agricultural policy has on a hungry world. The progress of American agriculture by our nation's farmers and ranchers has allowed us to produce the highest quality, safest, most affordable food supply in the history of the world. This efficiency has allowed us to make the most dramatic reduction in climate impact and decrease our carbon footprint. I simply ask this committee, as it forges new trade agreements and passes legislation, to remember that the efficiency of our food production is the single biggest factor in combating world hunger. We as farmers and ranchers understand that when the government allows us to do what we do best, the world is a better place. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for hosting us. Mr. Bach, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on Minnesota's potential to contribute to our nation's critical mineral supply chains and our renewable energy future. As a lifelong Minnesotan, I'm incredibly proud of the state's deep history of responsible mining. For more than 140 years, Minnesota's iron industry has supported the communities of northern Minnesota through job creation and economic development, while supplying materials that have been vital in building America's infrastructure and supporting our national security. In fact, much of the American military fleet that helped the U.S. win World War II came from iron produced by hardworking miners on the Iron Range in Minnesota. What many people don't realize is that northeastern Minnesota is also home to vast, untapped mineral resources that are key to our nation's future, and in particular, our clean energy transition. Electric cars, wind turbines, solar panels, energy storage solutions, and transmission lines all require vast quantities of critical minerals. A single wind turbine contains almost 5 tons of copper, and hybrid cars require nearly twice as much copper as a standard vehicle. Nickel is fundamental in the production of batteries for energy storage and for electric vehicles. Cobalt is a key element in rechargeable batteries, and the leading domestic use for platinum group metals is for catalytic converters that decrease emissions from automobiles. All these critical minerals are abundant underground in my home state of Minnesota. This undeveloped resource is called the Duluth Complex Geologic Formation. It's the largest untapped deposit of its kind in the world. So how significant is the Duluth Complex for our clean energy transition? Let's look at electric vehicles as an example. This deposit contains enough copper to build 310 million electric vehicles. The deposit contains enough nickel to manufacture 200 million electric vehicles. To me, that's mind-blowing. The potential that lies untapped in the Duluth complex is deeply important to me. For nearly 3 decades, I proudly represented the communities of northeastern Minnesota where the deposit is located. And during that time, I've also witnessed firsthand the sharp decline of those communities, and that saddens me. These minerals aren't only needed for the clean energy transition, they will also spur much-needed economic development in an area of Minnesota that desperately needs it. Since retiring, I've devoted a significant amount of time to serving as a consultant for several natural resource companies in the region. I believe strongly that developing critical minerals in Minnesota and in the U.S. more broadly is a no-brainer. It's a must-do. Opening non-ferrous mining operations spurs American job creation, strengthens our supply chains and our national security. It fuels the green economy and ensures we mine these resources under the highest labor and environmental standards. Yet numerous mining projects in the U.S., including ones in Minnesota, are facing endless legal and permitting challenges that make it next to impossible to access these resources. The data is clear. We need to mine these materials if we're going to be successful in combating the negative effects of climate change. According to the International Energy Agency, meeting the Paris Agreement climate goals will require a worldwide quadrupling of mineral requirements for clean energy technologies by 2040. But the United States depends on foreign sources of these materials, reached an all-time high in 2022. It is frankly unacceptable that the U.S. continues to import critical metals from areas of the world where environmental and labor standards are practically non-existent, especially when we have these resources and companies that are proposing to develop them responsibly and sustainably here at home. You know what makes no sense to me? On one hand, we set aggressive goals on reducing our nation's greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, we're slowing down or halting mining projects that are needed to meet those goals. That means we're importing critical minerals or clean energy end products from across the globe. Consider the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that, when we could instead be producing these items here in the United States. We also must not assume that we can continue to rely on others to supply us with our resources. China's latest effort to impose export controls on 2 critical minerals on the U.S. should be a wake-up call. It's no secret that China has a monopoly on many of the world's critical mineral supply chains. We must act now to accelerate our investment in mining capacity here in the U.S. Our critical mineral supply chains will become even more jeopardized than they already are. This means we need to change the narrative around mining in this country. We need to have serious conversations to address the inefficiencies of our environmental review and permitting processes. It's urgent that we stop putting up roadblocks to domestic mineral production because our ability to avoid devastating supply chain disruptions and build a greener future depend on it. Thank you. I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Olson, you are recognized.
Chairman Smith and members of the committee, my name is Carolyn Olson, and I serve as the Vice President of the Minnesota Farm Bureau Federation, representing nearly 30,000 members across the state. I'd like to welcome Chairman Smith to my great state and say thank you for holding this important hearing. Additionally, I'd like to thank my representative, Congresswoman Fischbach, for all her work on behalf of farmers in Minnesota's 7th District. My husband and I farm near Cottonwood, Minnesota, where we grow organic crops for a variety of uses and feed hogs for conventional markets. Farmers here in Minnesota could really use some rain, and drought conditions are present across our state and throughout the country. We remain hopeful for summer rains to come and want to highlight how difficult a drought situation like this can be in rural America. When weather conditions out of our control hamper the ability to grow an abundant and safe food supply, it is incredibly frustrating on emotional and economic levels. Regarding the topic of today's hearing, I cannot overstate the importance of trade to the agriculture industry. As members of this committee may be aware, farmers in the U.S. rely on trade for approximately 20% of our agricultural products. And according to the USDA Economic Research Service, U.S. agricultural exports reached $196 billion in sales in 2022. Minnesota is the fourth largest agricultural export state in the nation, and our products are worth $9.2 billion annually, according to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. This importance is highlighted at my own farm gate. The organic grains grown on my farm are utilized in multiple exported products, including alcoholic spirits, organic animal feed, and shelf-ready products. Many of these exported products are sent to Canada and the European Union, and my family has worked hard to earn production equivalency certifications so that our grains can be used in those imported products. The demand created from this opportunity means real dollars to my farm and strengthens the long-term viability of our 110-year-old operation. Just like any business, more buyers for our products creates more competition, and more competition makes for favorable margins. In addition to our organic grains, we also see the importance of trade to the hogs we finish. The pork industry is incredibly efficient, and demand for pork continues to remain strong across the globe. The U.S. pork industry has responded to that demand for decades. Meat products from our hogs are often exported to Mexico or China, and one plant we sell to is in the process of preparing facilities to be able to ship products to Japan. Many of these countries are purchasing variety meats, like offal, which are not consumed in great amounts in the United States. This continues to highlight the importance of international trade to United States agriculture because these countries are purchasing products at a premium that have very little demand in our country. Examples like mine are why continued efforts to expand market access to U.S. agriculture are so vital to farmers like me. Not only does trade create economic benefits for those growing the commodities, but it also strengthens our foreign relationships. Farmers want greater access to trade opportunities, and foreign consumers demand more of our high-quality and safe commodities. This situation is a win-win for all. In addition to the opportunities trade provides, our trade agreements also provide a framework to ensure fairness between ourselves and our trade partners. An example of this is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, also known as the USMCA. We know that Canada and Mexico are the second and third largest importers of agricultural goods and value the trade relationship we have with them. We are encouraged that the U.S. has been working through the USMCA's processes to dispute behaviors by both Canada and Mexico. Whether it is Canada with dairy imports or Mexico on biotech corn, we advocate for the continued efforts by our trade representatives and are hopeful for an equitable outcome. Changing gears to the supply chain, I believe it is important to recognize the connection between trade and the ability to move goods. If we cannot get our products to the places that have a high demand for them, then all our hard work to produce them is null and void. Here in Minnesota, we are blessed with many ways to move goods, from the Mississippi River, Duluth Port, the rail system, and through trucking. The Minnesota Farm Bureau is hopeful to see growth in the use of the Duluth Port for agricultural products and believes that utilizing the world's largest freshwater port will lead to continued opportunities for the transportation of our commodities to other countries. Additionally, maintaining the Mississippi River system is vital for Minnesota and the nation, as it is a powerful corridor for the movement of goods. I thank the committee for this opportunity to testify on behalf of Minnesota farmers and ranchers and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Vold, you're recognized.
First of all, I want to also thank Congresswoman Fischbach and Chairman Smith for the opportunity to be here today. It is a great honor. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the distinguished members of the committee for providing me with the opportunity to share my testimony with all of you today. It is an honor to explain the reality of the American dairy farm, including the ripple effect of dairy export market access, the impacts being felt by my family and family farms across the country as a result of economic pressures levied by trade partners such as the Canadian government and the European Union. My name is Brad Vold, and I own and operate Dorridge Dairy in Glenham, Minnesota, about an hour west of here, along with my wife, Suzanne, and my brother, Greg. Our farm was established in 1899. We are currently a fourth-generation family dairy operation. Dorich Dairy is a 500-cow dairy that converted to robotic milking in October of 2019. Our operation includes 600 acres of cropland that supplies part of the feed to our dairy cows. All of our young stock are custom-raised off-site. We employ 1 full-time and 2 part-time employees, and we have been Land O'Lakes Dairy Cooperative member owners since 1992. In 2022, the U.S. dairy industry exported over $9.6 billion in dairy products to foreign markets, equivalent to 18% of the U.S. total milk production. These export sales play a key role in supporting the health of dairy farms like mine in Minnesota and throughout the U.S. Exports also support rural communities, hundreds of thousands of workers and companies supplying inputs and services, those in downstream processing cooperatives like Land O'Lakes, and the cities with large port facilities heavily dependent on trade. Since the implementation of NAFTA in 1994, free trade agreements have enabled the U.S. dairy industry to compete on a more level playing field with international competitors in terms of tariff access, removal of non-tariff barriers, clear and consistent rules for trade. Unfortunately, the U.S. dairy competitors in Europe, New Zealand, and Australia continue to benefit from up-to-date free trade agreements while the United States has failed to finalize new comprehensive trade deals in over a decade, putting American exporters at a distinct disadvantage in growing foreign markets. As an American dairy producer, I need the U.S. government to pursue comprehensive free trade agreements in key markets with growing demand for dairy imports, including Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, others in the Southeast Asia and the Middle East. But new agreements aren't enough. They need to work for farmers. Unfortunately, free trade agreements such as the USMCA have missed the mark in terms of providing the security that dairy producers like my family need to stay in business. Canada has continued to fall short of their commitments to the United States, failing to uphold its USMCA dairy tariff quota obligations by providing preferential treatment to their domestic producers. To provide an example of how Canada has operated, in 2017, an abrupt change in Canada's Class 7 milk pricing structure blocked ultra-filtrated exports from Grassland Dairy Products Incorporated, a dairy processor in Greenwood, Wisconsin. They were given a 48-hour notice that the Canadian markets would no longer be accepting their product. Grassland then proceeded to send letters to approximately 75 dairies, notifying them that they would lose their contracts in just 30 days. Similarly, many dairy producers are feeling the effects of the European Union's misuse of geographical indicators to monopolize generic food and beverage terms in multiple countries around the world, which threatens the ability of U.S. dairy producers to sell products that rely on commonly used terms like Parmesan and Havarti in key export markets. I would like to take a moment to thank Congresswoman Fischbach, my own representative, for co-sponsoring the Safeguarding American Value-Added Exports Act, SAVE, H.R. 3223, an effort to combat the EU's economic coercion. This effort would direct the USDA to work with U.S. trade representatives to establish protections for specific common food and beverage names, utilizing negotiations that would result in memorandum of understanding and exchanges of letters with clear assurances protecting these export opportunities. Dairy producers can only survive and thrive when we have open markets and a home for our milk. The United States is the second largest producer of the world in milk. If we can't move product, it affects the bottom line of American dairy producers and the economic benefit our sector provides to communities across the country. We must focus on stimulating trade and maintaining and exporting our export markets. Thank you all for your consideration of my testimony and service to our nation. I appreciate the work of this committee to recognize the important role that co-ops play in rural America. The work of my family and so many others hinges on individuals like you, all continuing to advocate and deliver solutions to the ag producers who make this country great. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wertish, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representatives Fischbach, Stauber, and Fenseth, and members of the committee. I'm honored that you're here in Minnesota and that I can speak with you. And thank you for those who traveled to be here in the Schiefelbeins for hosting us. My name is Gary Wertish, President of Minnesota Farmers Union. I have farmed all my life, and now my wife and I rent our farm to our son. MFU is a grassroots organization that has represented Minnesota family farmers, ranchers, and rural communities since 1918. Together with National Farmers Union, our organization works to protect and enhance the economic interests and quality of life of family farmers, ranchers, and rural residents. Minnesota's agriculture is the foundation of our state's economy and generating over $100 billion in economic impact and supporting nearly 400,000 jobs. Trade is a significant part of that, with agricultural products accounting for more than 1/3 of our state's total exports. If done right, I believe that trade can help farmers earn a fair price for the products they worked hard to produce. In my testimony today, I want to emphasize 3 key considerations that I believe will help ensure our national trade policy benefits family farmers and builds supply chain resilience. You can also find more detail on these topics in the written testimony I have submitted. Trade should be fair and stable, build on our strengths, contributing to resilience here at home, and supplement strong, competitive domestic markets. I have had the opportunity to participate in various trade missions with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. In my discussions with farmers and food business owners on those trips, they are looking for trade agreements that are fair, stable, and predictable. Farmers, workers, and trade partners shouldn't be left at the end of a long global commodity supply chain, forced to accept prices that are determined based on global events out of their control. Regarding our trading relationships, we can be tough and create trade agreements that benefit our farmers, workers, and businesses, but we cannot go it alone. A fair and stable trade system that creates access to markets and ensures predictability is the first step in guaranteeing farmers receive a fair price for what they produce. As a corn farmer, I value exports for grain, but I would much rather turn that corn into ethanol at a local cooperatively owned plant and export the ethanol and byproducts. This is just one example of how we can build on our strengths by adding value to what we produce locally. Finally, I believe that if farmers are going to earn a stable, fair living, international trade should be viewed as a supplement to strong, competitive domestic markets. We cannot depend on international markets alone for a fair price for Minnesota farmers. That is why MFU is a proud supporter of the National Farmers Union's Fairness for Farmers campaign, which focuses on the need to rein in the power of corporate monopolies and create fair and open markets for farmers and rural communities. Our farm and food system have become highly consolidated with a small handful of companies controlling the inputs farmers rely upon, along with the markets we need to access to sell our products. The rise of these highly consolidated middlemen is a key reason that farmers' share of each dollar spent on food has declined from 50% in 1952 to just 14% in 2021, the lowest on record. MFU supports efforts to promote diverse market opportunities, strengthen antitrust enforcement, modernize the Packers and Stockyards Act to protect family livestock producers, ensure accurate and transparent labeling of agriculture goods. Farmers should be able to market their products in diverse and competitive markets, locally, regionally, domestically, and internationally. Export markets can be important for farm incomes, but only when strong competitive domestic markets are available as well. I want to thank the committee again for coming to Minnesota for this hearing and for the opportunity to testify today. MFU is committed to working with this committee on these important topics, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll now move on to questions. Mr. Schiefelbein, someone who also raises cattle in my farm back in Missouri, I I certainly feel at home right here. Your facilities are much nicer than mine, and your tractors are a little bit bigger. But America's farmers and ranchers, they need fair treatment across the board, both in our export markets and here in the United States relative to competition from imports. I know in many of these markets, both tariffs and non-tariff barriers place American beef, poultry, and pork at a disadvantage relative to foreign competitors. As a rancher, can you share your perspective on why fair treatment in export markets is so important to ranchers, in particular in markets like the United Kingdom and Asia, where the administration is currently negotiating but failing to seek more market access for U.S. exports in these areas? And can you share some examples of the barriers that we must address in order to obtain fair treatment in this region?
Well, thank you for the question, Chairman. And as you can imagine, when you have the greatest product in the world, you want to have access to everywhere, plain and simple. And fair trade is good when you have the best product, and that's what we want. We want to have complete open access to every country because of that. It was amazing, and I wished I would have recorded my discussions with the UK government when I was over there last year. They pleaded, and maybe more accurately, begged our government to engage in trade. They said, we want to buy American beef. And in fact, I'll build on that. When we had dinner that night, on the menu were all the various varieties of beef. They had New Zealand beef and American beef. And we just said, you know what? We're going to sample each one of those, see if we really are the best, right? What do you think happened when we tried to order the American beef? Not available. Quota was hit. Product not available. Lost opportunity for a market. That's where we need our government engaged. That's where we need our government involved. What they tend to do, and you hit the point right on, is they tend to put these artificial barriers in there, and they use things like scientific words to describe why they don't want their product. They simply are a barrier to entry for our product. We want free and open trade for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bach, a key concern in America's failure to maximize our domestic mining and processing of critical minerals, it means we remain dependent on imports from nations like China and other bad actors, such as hostile governments and countries that rely on forced labor. What impact does the Biden administration's hostility towards mining of critical minerals and other resources here in the U.S., for example, cobalt, nickel, and copper, right here in Minnesota, have on Minnesota's economy and the security of our supply chains?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just recently, the Biden administration canceled some federal mineral leases that were under lease to a mining company that was working on a scoping document potentially to open a mine after hadn't even entered the environmental review process yet. And he terminated the leases. Those leases had been in place for over 50 years. And for some reason, decided to cancel them. And it totally runs contrary to the management plan of the Superior National Forest. Those leases are in an area in Minnesota, and the management plan for the Superior National Forest where they are, mining is a desired use in the management plan for the forest. So it really runs contrary to his own U.S. Forest Service management plan. But it potentially, if that project is not developed, it's a huge hit to the region. That one project, and there are a number of projects being considered, there would have been 750 permanent jobs, 1,500 vendor jobs that service that mine. Wow. Just an outstanding number of people. And the mine life, we only permit mines for 25-year segments. But 25 years at a time, that deposit would have supported several generations of miners at those kind of numbers, 750 families plus 1,500 families working in the vendor community that supports it. And then there's the issue of, well, where are the metals going to come from? If they don't come from here, and you did hear me say in my testimony, the largest undeveloped body of ore of this type, cobalt, nickel, palladium, platinum group metals, cobalt, is in northern Minnesota, largest in the world. And the exponential growth in the use of those minerals for the new renewable energy economy, I don't know where the metals are going to come from. You know, and it's pretty easy to go to photo ops in places like Detroit, no disrespect to Michigan, but where you have tens of thousands of workers and tout how we're going to make all of these electric vehicles in Detroit. The fact of life is, unless they get the minerals that they need, you're not going to be able to complete them. They won't have enough parking lot because without the batteries and the copper and the nickel that's necessary, the whole notion of trying to build this renewable energy economy is going to fail. And in this case, it'll be the fault of our federal government. Runs contrary to their own objectives.
Thank you, sir. The next question is for Ms. Olson, Mr. Vold, and also Mr. Wertish. Each of you come from farming families spanning more than a generation. You all know firsthand the impact of trade on farmers and the importance of having fair agreements that are enforced. Whether it's Mexico's ban on American corn, Canada's failure to uphold its bargain regarding dairy industry, or other examples you all might have, why is tough and effective enforcement of America's trade agreements critical to farmers and rural communities that they support? Ms. Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In our case, you would think that we would be jumping up and down. We sell organic corn, and Mexico doesn't want genetically engineered corn. You'd think that that would be a great thing for us. It's not. We need a strong conventional corn market, and that includes the biotech corn. What we see in Farm Bureau is we need equal playing field for all farmers that are growing corn, for the ability to export into Mexico. And we really would like to see the enforcement action there, because in my personal case, today it's genetically engineered crops such as corn. What is it going to be tomorrow? And the enforcement process is there, and we support going through that process to enforce what they promised that they would do. And that benefits all farmers in Minnesota, whether they're growing conventional non-GMO corn or organic corn.
Mr. Volt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, simply put, without enforcement, these agreements would end up hurting us more than helping us. And I can't speak directly towards the corn conflict with Mexico because my focus is primarily on dairy. So I am going to revert back to the Canadian situation with the Class 7 ultra-filtrated milk ban. And one thing people need to understand from a dairy farmer's perspective living in a small rural community is the fact that when a situation like this happens, it directly affects not only farm families who are given literally just days to find a home for their milk that they were having processed locally. The dairy industry right now, as we all are maybe aware of, is in an over-surplus situation. You do not just get on the phone and make a phone call to another dairy processing facility to have your milk picked up. So there's some very serious consequences when a situation like this takes place. These families run the risk of literally losing their operations that have been in effect for generations. And not only is the operation lost, but it's every other business that's connected to that operation. We figure that every dollar we generate on our farm is probably turned over 6 or 7 times in a local community. So you take out the roots of your economic value, it sends a shockwave not only through your community, through your industry, but also through your economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wertish.
Sorry. The biggest, like Brad mentioned, raising grains, it's not, you don't have a perishable commodity like milk. Obviously, they're in a different timeline on that. But you can only store it so long, and at some point, we need this, you really need the stability in the markets, because if you have, all of a sudden, the trade agreement is not enforced, and your market goes down a significant number, you still got grain to market. You have loans to pay. You have debt to service. You can't just put it in the bin and tell your banker, I'm sorry, I'll just pay interest, and sometimes they're fine with that. But if you look at the younger farmers, don't have that kind of net worth. They have to move that crop every year, sell to be able to just cash flow and service their debt. So any uncertainty, disruption in trade agreements by not enforcing them, it definitely will hurt the younger farmers the hardest.
Thank you. Pleased to recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, for any questions she has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wertish, you just spoke a little bit to trade enforcement and its benefits for U.S. farmers and workers that the Biden administration, it's very loud, has prioritized for farmers, workers, and families. Just to set the record straight, the USTR did, in fact, enact enforcement actions against Canada in the dairy sector and Mexico in the corn sector. Is that not correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. And there have been a number of enforcement mechanisms that USTR has actually initiated as a result of the trade agreements that we've negotiated, one with Japanese beef, the other with the European Union for some of what we consider to be market barriers. So there is robust enforcement being attempted by this current administration. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And, some of the trouble runs that, it's not the administration's fault. Some of it is just the complexity of the agreements. And you're working with other countries around the world, the complexity is a lot of times the problem. It's not necessarily all the administration's fault. I believe the administration is doing some of the enforcement agreements within their power.
I think they're acting fairly aggressively, as a matter of fact, because their track record with respect to previous administrations' enforcement actions is actually grown exponentially. I want to ask about, we are in the midst of renegotiating the Farm Bill for this year. During a Farm Bill year, how can federal and tribal governments work with farmers to promote not just production, which is necessary and important and which we want to encourage, but we also want to encourage it in an environmentally safe way. So how can we work with farmers to promote environmental stewardship as well as we look to reauthorizing the Farm Bill?
Well, one thing I'd like to thank the current administration or the USDA for their climate smart technology or the programs that they're initiating and providing funding. A lot of that is, we all want to do a good job environmentally. I think we all can agree that we are doing, as farmers, we're doing a better job than we did, say, our forefathers did. And a lot of that is through technology, and some of it is just plain learning how to do things better and taking things a little more serious and seeing what the damage was actually happening, which we didn't realize it. At one time, you see it in a lot of your manufacturing companies are built along rivers. You had a lot of farms built along creek sides. That part is being taken care of. That is being addressed. So I think, any type of funding or incentives that you could put in the Farm Bill to help farmers do that. Farmers, you're always it's always a tough time cash flowing. You don't have high prices all the time. Right now, our prices are sliding, and our inputs are high. So that it's getting to be very tight to even be able to pay your bills. So any incentives that we can get for the farmer to change some of his practices, maybe change some of the type of equipment, it's really a benefit to everybody. Because if you're up against, just wondering if you're going to actually be able to pay your loan back, and if your banker is going to go along with you another year, it's pretty hard to change your practices on your farm because you just can't afford to. Then it gets to be you might see something out there that would do a better job, but financially, you just can't afford to take that risk, because by taking that risk, if it doesn't work exactly the way you wanted, you could lose your farm.
Very understandable. And finally, I was wondering if you could speak briefly to the current challenges concerning the labor workforce that the agricultural industry is facing. We know that there are worker shortages in many different sectors, but specific to agricultural industry, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's no doubt that, as all of the United States is addressing labor shortages, it is hitting the farmers hard. Brad here is a dairy farmer. It's hitting the dairy industry hard. I have a couple of members that are a little bit larger vegetable type operations. They're having a hard time getting employees, and we have a few members that are just commercial, regular commodity type farmers. They rely on some help from they've been using South Africans, but they've had a harder time getting them here. So they're definitely immigration alone and some of the H-2A visas. If we could, anything we could do to speed it up and really address the immigration problem is what you might call it, because those workers, in most cases, those people want to come here. And we have people that are willing to come here and work, but they can't get here. So sometimes they come illegally, and then that just creates another issue.
We have tried with the bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act. We've not been successful in making that law, but we are working on that. And finally, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I just want to comment for Ms. Olson. Getting goods to market is important, and so that's why I'm very pleased in the last Congress we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill to try to improve ways to move goods and services efficiently throughout different regions. And with that, I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carolyn, thank you Ms. Olson. Be more formal, but thank you so much for being here. And enforcement of existing trade agreements is a critical issue across commodities, and I think we've talked about that a little bit. Proposals from Mexico regarding their unscientific ban of genetically modified corn is a recent reminder, and you've mentioned this, and that we have been hold our trading partners accountable to the promises they can make. Can you speak about the impacts? And I think you did talk a little bit about it, about the impact, lack of action on this issue for your organic farm, but also maybe talk a little bit more broadly about your experience with as Vice President of Farm Bureau and what you're hearing from others. And do understand I'm under a 5-minute time limit, so but thank you.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. For us personally, strong conventional corn markets helps drive the organic market. Prices are not tied together, they're more held together by rubber bands. So when the conventional market goes up, eventually we'll catch up, and when it goes down, eventually we catch up to that as well. So as organic farmers, how it impacts us the most is when commodity prices fall because of lack of the export market, then it will affect my farm as well. And that's the most direct personally. Our members are concerned, 30,000 members in Minnesota, and they are concerned about losing a market. Many of our friends grow both organic and conventional. Some are just conventional, some are growing non-GMO and conventional. Minnesota grows a lot of corn in a lot of ways, and mostly what they're concerned about is the loss of a market and what happens next. What if it's this ban this time that is, for whatever reason, because it's not based on science, what is the next thing that's coming? So to enforce that, you prevent that Pandora's box from being opened.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Scheffelbein, you mentioned a little bit about some of your trips abroad that you were talking about, and I'm just wondering, if you can speak to the importance of these missions. You touched on them just a little bit, and what it means with a comparatively inactive USTR.
Yeah, and again, and I don't mean to be any disrespectful to anybody, but I'm going to answer it candidly. And I'm so excited about you all getting a chance to meet my family. I have 3 beautiful daughters that are incredibly bright and talented, but I really don't need the government's help in raising my kids. Okay? Where I do need your help is the constitutional requirement to open trade agreements for us. And if you look at when we engage the United States, great things happen. When we disengage, guys, lost opportunities abound. And I just encourage you all, don't be MIA. Get involved. Figure out how we can engage U.S. agriculture, sell the best products in the world to the world, and great things will come. So that's my plea for you, Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vold, you talked a little bit about the SAFE Act, and you mentioned that, and maybe you can just expand a little bit on what it really means, to protect those, just expand a little, and protect those generic titles.
Absolutely. So Land O'Lakes produces and markets a lot of common name products. For example, a lot of the milk that I produce in my farm is made into Parmesan, which is one of those common name products that is being targeted. So it's really more than a relabeling issue, because if we have to rename the product that my dairy produces because it's a generic name, that really basically spells down to a lost market share, because it basically it just creates confusion in the marketplace, because I can have a container of Parmesan here, and then I'm going to have this newly named U.S. product that most European markets and U.S. domestic markets aren't going to recognize. So the bottom line is it directly affects my business. And again, it's a ripple effect through the industry, and that's with so many products that my co-op produces.
Thank you very much. And Senator Bach, I would have gotten to you, but I know that Representative Stauber has a couple of questions for you. So thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Stauber is recognized.
Thank you very much. And Frosty, I've only met one of your children, and I'll tell you what a blueprint for America. Congratulations, and it's a blueprint for all of us. Your comments are spot on. We appreciate them so much. Just last week, China announced that it plans to impose export restrictions on two important minerals, which are both used in semiconductors and EV batteries. This, they say, is in retaliation of our own export controls on certain semiconductors to China. China is doing this because they can. They control the vast majority of rare earth and critical minerals in the entire world. China has a long history of engaging in trade wars with the United States and other countries, and the world's increasingly dependence on critical minerals and China's growing control over these same minerals. It will only lead to a greater and greater threat to the United States and our allies. What is stopping China from banning the export of cobalt, nickel, or copper? Critical minerals will be the most sought-after commodity of this 21st century, and the United States is setting up China to hold the same power OPEC did over global oil supply chain in the 70s. The opportunity we have here in the United States is not only become a critical mineral independent, but become critical mineral dominant. We have an incredible opportunity to export these minerals to allies and partners around the globe, lessening the grip of countries like China on global supply chains. Senator Bach, thank you for agreeing to come here and be an expert witness. On behalf of Northeastern Minnesota, your service to our state is commendable. We want to talk about promoting mining. In your statement, you said there's trillions of dollars. I want to add to that because a leading geologist said there's trillions and trillions and trillions of minerals in the Duluth complex. When crafting trade agreements with other countries, one of the biggest focuses of policymakers is protecting our workers here in the United States, along with ensuring workers in other countries have proper working conditions and receive fair wages. Senator, in your written testimony, you touched upon some of the projects here in Minnesota that are being held up at every turn. One project in particular is on its 20th year of permitting and just had its Clean Water Act permit pulled a few weeks ago. Historic. Never has happened in the United States. Can you share can you share some of the benefits that the jobs these projects would bring and the impact that they would have on our local economies in northeastern Minnesota and the nation broadly?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Stauber. I should have mentioned first in my earlier answer, if I could digress for a second, it's worse than just the 2 mineral leases that the Biden administration canceled. In addition, by executive order, they put a moratorium on 225,000 acres of land in northern Minnesota for 20 years. No exploration, nothing. It's frustrating. I look at those communities, some of those communities that I represent, the city of Ely, for example, and the city of Babbitt kind of bookend these projects. I think, if I remember right, 15 kids graduated from the Babbitt School this year. When I graduated, they were graduating about 150. And Ely, same situation, bigger town, about 3,200 people. They went from graduating about almost 200 people when I was in school to 47 this year. Rural Minnesota needs economic development. Rural America needs economic development if these communities are going to survive. I often say, if you want to look at the health of a community, take a look at their school census. Because for a community to be healthy, you need young families that are raising kids, putting kids in school. And if you don't have that, you're a community that is slowly dying. But the jobs lost are just exponential. And it's opportunities for generations that are lost. And what's problematic is we're not even allowed to do a scoping document to consider what environmental issues there might be. So nobody can even come and, you're bad enough you can't do an environmental assessment. You can't even do the scoping document that would tell you what should we study, what is the potential impacts to the environment. So it's bad for Minnesota, it's bad for the country. Frankly, I think it's bad for the world, because as these critical mineral shortages happen, prices are going to go up exponentially, and we all will pay a price for that. We need more development all across the country and across the world.
Now, we'll just end with this. Thank you for your comments. Minnesota is ready, able, and willing to mine these. And this administration's policies of anywhere but America and any worker but American has to stop. We must control our own destiny. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Moore is recognized for questions.
Thank you so very, very much. And I do want to thank Representative Fischbach for hosting us. Pardon? I'm sorry. For hosting us here. I am a neighbor. I am from the great state of Wisconsin, so I can really relate to the agricultural challenges and the climate challenges that face our states here in what is not flyover country. I just wanted to point out that while Minnesota claims it's the state of 10,000 lakes, probably about 11,400 lakes, but Wisconsin has more. We have 15,000 lakes. That being said, we do need to protect water, and so I guess my first question is going to go to Senator Bach. I really agree with you that in your testimony you mentioned that we could, with the amount of nickel and copper, perhaps in northern Minnesota, we could create 310 million electrical vehicles. With the amount of nickel we have, 200 million, and I'm so glad to see young people here, because I think that we've gone from a place where starvation in the world was a real risk to, with new technologies, with science, we've learned how to do things better so that we can feed the world. So my question really is that has the Army Corps of Engineers said that the sort of, and I don't know if you're in relation with Glencore company, the largest mining company in the world?
Relationship with them.
You don't? Well, they have projects, Polymet. I was just reading in literally the paper, the Star Tribune, today. There was an editorial about transparency being at risk for Minnesotans. They said that the international Glencore owns all of Polymet Mining Corporation, and they were very concerned that the massive copper-nickel deposits in Lake Superior and boundary waters would be harmed. And so I'm wondering if that is part of the challenge that you're facing with regard to the permitting process, the notion that the boundary waters have to be properly protected.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Moore. And first, let me say, no one loves the boundary waters more than those of us that live next to it.
Yeah.
We don't go there on vacation. It's 6 miles from my home.
Yeah.
And I have spent hundreds of nights in a tent there, and the last thing I would do is support a process that in any way diminished the environmental quality of that. But I should say, just for the record, that the Polymet project, and I don't have any relationship with them, is on the site of an taconite mine that went bankrupt, where we mined already for 50 years. And it is not in the Boundary Waters watershed in any way. It's in the watershed of Lake Superior, and the river that runs from the Polymet, potentially the Polymet tailings basin, it's 130 miles of river before you ever got to Lake Superior. Mm-hmm. But I think what's critically important is those of us that live in northern Minnesota, we've supported mining, and we've mined there for 140 years.
Right.
And if you talk to, or you can look at the studies from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they will tell you that the cleanest water in all of Minnesota is in northeastern Minnesota, where 140 years of mining has been going on.
Well, okay, you weren't mining the same sort of things, and so the Army Corps of Engineers is just sort of trying to protect the water. I need to ask Mr. at the end. Wordish. Right. So, can you just talk about how these the increasing tensions for the responding to climate change and really having a sustainable environment is related. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is how can you be efficient and still push back against large corporations taking over the farms? I know in Wisconsin we had lots of suicides among small farmers because of the large corporate farming, argument being we're more efficient, we're big. Can you tell me what we could do to make sure that environmentally sustainable methods are being used while we protect small farmers and still be environmentally sustainable?
One thing I think would help on the environment is take the politics out of it. It's been turned into a political, whether you call it global warming or climate change or whatever it was. But I can tell you about a month ago, right now on our farm, as you came up with the bus, you saw the extreme stress on the corn that's up here. Some of that corn, even with get rain, some of that might not make it, and if it does, it'll be very, very low yielding. About a month ago, our farmers got stressed too on their corn. About a month ago, about 15 miles from my farm, there was an area, it wasn't a large area, but they got 10 inches of rain in 2 hours. Those are the things that are happening. I'm glad to see, for the most part, most people on both sides of the aisle are starting to take that a little more serious, which we need to. So that is a challenge. And as far as efficiency with the larger equipment and all that, it does make it harder, challenging for a smaller farmer to make it. In the first place, the larger equipment, you can harvest so many more acres in a day, but that's not necessarily always more efficient though either. You can have a small farm that can be very efficient, but some of it goes back to the access to markets. They need a fair price for their product so they can make a living on their farm. Brad here's got 500 cows. I grew up on a dairy farm. My father had, I think, around 30 cows. Made a nice living on that. You can't do that anymore, and that's the problem.
Thank you so much. The chairman is looking at me.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. You've been to so many of our field hearings, I gave you a little bit more time, so we appreciate that. Mr. Finstad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I look around this room, I see some of the best environmentalists and conservationists that this country has to offer. And we have done it as farmers over generations because the best asset, the biggest asset that we have is the land that we're going to pass on to the next generation. And so for us, it is everything to make sure that we are leaving it better for our kids. And I see so many folks in this room that are doing that day in, day out. So thank you. Mr. Scheffelbein, so I feel like an underachiever. I only have 7 children, 5 boys, 2 girls. But thank you so much.
It's not too late.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good start, right? It's a good start. Thank you so much for hosting this today. And just want you to know and your family to know that Big Frank was a great man, someone that I looked up to. I was elected to the Minnesota House when I was 24 years old, and I remember meeting him right away, and I'm like, who is this guy? He knows everything. And what drew me to him was his kind heart. He was a good man with a kind heart that really cared about our state and, again, cared about the next generation and what we can do to make sure that we're leaving farm country better. So it's an honor to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the trade deficit. As an ag trade deficit right now, we're at about $14.5 billion this year. And our overall trade deficit has reached a staggering $945 billion, the largest ever. And so I guess my question is probably pretty simple. A lot of us in this room believe that we have to have free trade, but it has to be fair trade. So as a producer that's been on these trade missions and someone that understands this, can you give us an idea of where do you see opportunities? What should we be focused on to try to balance that trade deficit?
Yeah, and the beef is so different from most commodities in that it has lots of pieces and lots of parts, that lots of different populations like this piece better than that piece. So from our perspective, the way we generate the most dollars back to the beef industry is get as many countries with as wide a variety of backgrounds as you possibly can, so the varying pieces and parts can be sold to their maximum utility. The other thing I said, and that's why my comments were so aggressive on efficiency, almost always when you go into trade agreements, they push back on the very things that make food available for the poorest of the poor. And to me, that's a disservice for not only the United States farmers, but for the world. We've got to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that what they may label as a scientific notation is real and not just another means to say, we don't want your efficiently produced product.
Thank you for that. Just a quick yes or no. So you talked about your production increases over 300% in the last 20 years or whatever it was. Did government make you do that? Did government tell you to do that?
No, they did not.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for doing it without being told. Ms. Olson, so thank you so much for being here. As we look at some of the trade issues that potentially lie before us, especially when it comes to animal disease, animal health. We look at African swine fever, the avian influenza. What can we do to be proactive and to start thinking about, the devastation that could happen? And if you could tell us a little bit about the reality of that devastation if African swine fever hits our shores. The second piece is when it comes to trade, what can we do now to start conversations with our trade partners about some of those major animal health diseases that we continually to face?
I'm going to answer that in reverse order, Mr. Congressman, if you are okay with that. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Mr. Chair. For our farm, the devastation is going to be a little bit more clear after I talk about the trade part. We need to be talking now about what what could happen if African swine fever gets onto the North American continent. That affects not only the U.S., it affects Mexico, it affects Canada. And with our proximity to Canada geographically and the number of live hogs that moves back and forth, we need to be discussing that right now, especially with those two trading partners. Discussing strategies for keeping it off of our continent or keeping it away from us as much as possible. Enforcement, detecting the meats coming in, people trying to bring cuts of pork in their luggage, the Beagle Brigade, funding those. But talking about the importance of that with our trade partners and looking at ways to mitigate the chances of it spreading is of utmost importance. If we don't do that and try and prevent it from coming to our shores, then we also need to be talking about our vaccines and our vaccine banks and that strategy and have our trading partners understand the importance of that as well. Because when it gets to my farm, what will happen is we are a contract finisher, which means we don't own the pigs, we do the labor, we own the barns, we own the manure. As an organic farmer, that manure is critical for our farm success. If we are unable to raise pigs any longer in our barns because we have to depopulate or our grower has to depopulate, that means we have no manure and no fertility for our organic crops, and that will be devastating for us. But not only the crops, it's also our neighbors who raise the corn and soybeans that go to feed the pigs. It's a ripple effect that will have an impact on the local economy that I can't even put into an estimate because it will be devastating. And Lyon County, where I live, is not even the largest pork-producing county. Your district is. So it would be utterly devastating. So it is critical that we do talk with our trading partners on strategies to keep it out.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, before I yield back, I just have to take this opportunity. I see a lot of our friends and neighbors that serve in law enforcement with the Minnesota State Patrol and others here today. I just want to thank them for being here. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Pleased to recognize the subcommittee chairman on trade, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to all of our panel here today, our panelists, experts certainly here in this region. Grateful for your participation and sharing your insight. Forgive me for expressing my frustration that the Biden administration is approaching trade with dialogues and frameworks rather than trade agreements, congressionally approved trade agreements that increase the opportunities for enforcement, trade agreements that increase opportunities for leveling the playing field on labor issues and the environment. And so I hope that we can see a shift. I'd like to see actually President Biden take a stage somewhere and make it very clear that what Mexico is doing with our corn is wrong. And that actually, if Mexico gets away with this, it will undermine all of our trade policies, our rules-based trade approach. So I'm glad that USTR is approaching the enforcement issue. I know that the Secretary of Agriculture has mentioned it a little bit, but what a great thing it would be for the president to take a stage. He doesn't even need corn stalks behind him, but just to make a statement that what Mexico is doing is wrong. And so that's why enforcement is so important. And I was wondering, Mr. Vold and Ms. Olson, can you touch, when it comes to enforcement, I think you've talked about it a little bit, but if you could elaborate why enforcement tools are so critical to dairy and corn producers respectively, and then if you can elaborate on the impact of what could happen to dairy and corn producers if we don't really address this issue with Mexico and also the dairy TRQ. Ms. Olson, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you. For us and for Farm Bureau, all of my farmers and friends in the neighborhood, If we lose the market with Mexico because they decided that they didn't want to take this type of corn, it would be devastating. Corn prices are sliding, as Mr. Wooders had indicated earlier. Corn prices are sliding. We were profitable last year. In 2021, farmers in southern Minnesota, each farmer had an impact of over $1 million in the local economy. It's like $1,109,000, and that is according to Farm Business Management numbers, so that is actual farm data. When we lose our markets, when the prices go down, because then we have too much domestic supply, that means farmers have trouble making ends meet. They will not be able to make enough of a profit to survive to farm another year. Sustainability also has to include financial sustainability, and trade markets are critical for that.
Mr. Vogt.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Smith and Chair, for the question. Again, I will stress the fact that enforcement is necessary. Otherwise, our trade issues will be devastated, and it will personally hurt our family farms. You mentioned a little bit about the TRQ. I know there's been some issues with the Canadian markets as far as them honoring the actual levels of TRQ. I am not a trade expert, but I am familiar with that as a dairy producer and the negative effects it will have on my business if we can't continue to get Canada to honor those agreements that have been in place. So with that, again, it's the ripple effect. If we can't enforce the agreements that we have in place with the Canadian government and Mexico, they are key players in the product that we move from my farm, and it will have a negative effect on the bottom line and again on my community. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you. And certainly thank you, Mr. Schiefelbein, for your hospitality here today. But if you could touch briefly on trade agreements actually lowering tariffs for beef and also the non-tariff trade barriers that you touched a little bit on, but if you could elaborate on that.
One only needs to look at the Korea agreement and see what good things occur when we engage with trade. There was a 40% tariff on beef. Okay, that phases out over the next 3 years to zero. Who do you think is our #1 exporter of beef today? Korea. If you put in free trade agreements that work and take away these barriers, great things happen. So I almost stood up and gave you a standing ovation, sir, because we need to engage in trade.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you. Mr. Schiefelbein, thank you so much for your hospitality. Look, you got to be all right. I wish I had the chance to meet Big Frank, if for no other reason than somebody who's got that car out there that Hubert and Muriel Humphrey rode around in is good enough for me. So thank you so much.
We met Grandma.
It's a great story. It really is. It is. Thank you so much. Look, we have some differences. But I think what this hearing shows is that we actually have a lot of common ground, those of us who represent the broad spectrum of American political thought. Driving out here, riding out here on this bus, I felt very much at home. This looks a lot like the district that I represent back in Michigan, where we have more lakes than Wisconsin. I'm not going any further than that. And not while I'm in Minnesota, I'm not. But the issue of trade enforcement has come up, and I just want to put a point on that. Enforcement is absolutely critical. Ensuring that our trading partners and the U.S. have mechanisms that are efficient to enforce trade, but also as we negotiate agreements, and I agree with many of my colleagues, and I have some disagreement with our own with the Biden administration on this point. We need an aggressive trade agenda. And we need it to be a trade agenda that comes through the United States Congress and includes congressional advice and consent, which is more sustainable, number one, but also gives us the opportunity as we negotiate with our trading partners to insist that they enact reforms in their own domestic practices, their legal structure, in order to make sure that we do have free and fair trade. This is really an important point. Now, the issue of corn obviously has been covered. I won't get further into that, but my corn growers certainly do need to have the technical aspects of USMCA adhered to, and not have, for cultural reasons, the President of Mexico decide to go in a different direction. It needs to be a science-based decision, and we hope that we can hold them accountable to that. But I want to touch on another area that's I know important to me and also to the folks here in Minnesota, and that has to do with sugar. Sugar growers support 144,000 jobs over the U.S., 2,000 local family sugar beet growers that I represent are absolutely dependent on that aspect of our economy. And these jobs are regularly threatened by unfair trade practices across the world that allows sugar to be sold at below production costs, undercutting American farmers. We have to ensure that we have trade tools to ensure American farmers can fairly compete and support the American workers. Now, last year, Congressman Earl Blumenauer and I traveled to the Dominican Republic to meet with workers there, and what we saw, I would say, is the closest thing that I've ever seen to modern slavery. Workers who were forced into dangerous working conditions, didn't receive the pay they were due often, living in abhorrent housing conditions. Forced labor has no place in the U.S. supply chain, and that's why I've been proud to work to make sure that we can get enforcement actions against those Dominican operations and ensure that we protect the ability for American growers to produce a high-quality product and get a fair price. So, as we move forward in a Farm Bill year, an important initiative that we have to support is the U.S. sugar farmers and the U.S. sugar program and push back against what some would argue for, and that is that we need to be more dependent on imports of sugar, even though we already import sugar from over 40 countries. This is a really important part of our agriculture policy in this country, and I wonder if Mr. Werdish and Ms. Olson, as leaders of the two largest farm organizations in Minnesota, can you talk about the sugar program and how important that is in the Farm Bill to Minnesota members, because I know it's important to the folks I represent back home in Michigan.
I'll go first. Thank you, Congressman and Chairman. In Minnesota Farm Bureau, we rely on the expertise of the two large sugar cooperatives in the state of Minnesota. We don't have a lot of our own policy on sugar because it is so complicated, but we would argue again for equitable trade and free trade for sugar as well, because we do have many members that raise sugar beets in our membership base as well. But it's not something that I'm an expert on, and it is very complicated as well. So I'll defer to Mr. Werdish.
Gary?
Thank you. Sugar obviously is very important to Minnesota, and we have two in Minnesota. We have one right across in Brecken or in Wahpeton. So we have three cooperatives, farmer-owned cooperatives, within Minnesota and the Red River Valley, and we are the largest producing area in the whole United States in beet sugar. The U.S. sugar program has worked very well as a no-cost program when it's run effectively, and it has. And for the most part, the USDA has done a good job administering that program. It's set up with TRQs, because we do need to import some sugar. We don't raise enough for ourselves. But at the same time, sugar on the global market, a lot of countries, they use the slave labor or whatever it is to produce it, and they dump that in the world market at 6 cents a pound or whatever number they have. You'll hear pressure from our confectionaries. I forget the exact acronym of their organization that we need to get rid of the sugar program because our consumers are paying so much more for a price for their candy bars and all that stuff. But the sugar program has run very effectively for a long time. I still remember when Kiki Garza was the chairman of the Ag Committee from Texas a long time ago. I'm an original sugar beet grower. I'm an original grower from the Renville plant. I don't raise anymore, so I do have a long history in that industry, and it's been very profitable. The jobs that we provide out of them plants are very profitable paying jobs in rural communities. That's what we need to do, and that's, as I talked about earlier, we need domestic policy too. And the more of those type of jobs we can have in rural communities, we all benefit. But Farmers Union, very strong supporter of the sugar program.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee. I would like to recognize Ms. Moore to enter into the record some newspapers, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I made a couple of references to newspapers that I read today from the Star Tribune. One is related to, it says TV forecasters take the heat for covering climate change. And this is with respect to your comments about how we need to take the politics out of climate change. And the other is from today's paper, transparency is at stake. And this is with regard to the Polymet Glencore copper nickel mine. And so with that, without objection, I'd like to put those in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Mr. Ferguson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues from Minnesota. I want to thank you all for inviting us up here to a land with so many people with so many funny accents. Y'all all sound different than we do. Despite the fact that we sound different, I have noticed some very common threads that exist between farmers and producers here in Minnesota and those back home in Georgia. These are family-owned businesses in many cases that are based on a few things. Number one, you want a vibrant economy where you can provide for your family in. You know, you want to be part of a community with being a decent, safe place to live. You want a brighter future for your children with a strong, good education, preparing them for 21st century economy. And you want the freedom to be who you want to be in this great country and to be able to speak with a good Southern accent or a Northern Minnesota accent, right, Pete? But at the core of that is American competitiveness. Because without a job and a strong economy and an ability to defend ourselves around the globe and here at home, we are weak. And all of the other things that we want for our families don't fall into place if we aren't strong globally. So there's been a lot of focus on trade, but I don't want us to ever lose the fact that we need to be always working on things that make America the most competitive place in the world to invest and do business, and then have the trade agreement come in on top is the icing on the cake. So, Mr. Scheffelbein, could you talk just briefly about how how much your input costs have gone up over the past couple of years? Describe a couple of those factors and the impact that has on your competitiveness in the global marketplace.
Yeah, costs have just gone enormously higher, and we're a high dollar use company anyway. But when you double $1 million or $2 million business, you're asking for a much larger line of credit. So it's huge, and its impact is immense. Then what you have is a occurrence like right now where we're in this drought, and you look at all those investments we made in all that infrastructure and all those commodities, and it just looks just incredible. So we're up 200% roughly across. The way my wife always says it, she gets a bill, you know what she says? Guess what? It doubled. And so that's kind of what we are facing.
So we don't need to lose sight of the fact that we need to be lowering input costs for the American farmer so that we can remain competitive around the globe. Mr. Wordish, you've got a situation where you've got farmers that have higher input costs, smaller margins. Talk to us a little bit about the impact on the monopolistic practices that exist in the processing side of this thing and in big business driving out family farms.
It's really all across agriculture. Mr. Scheifelein, as a beef farmer, does a tremendous job here. But in the meat processing industry, you have the four packers that control 85% of the slaughter capacity. The worst part about that is two of those are foreign owned, not even owned by United States companies. And that, the Packers and Stockyards Act was passed in 1921 because Congress, those of you right in front of us, decided to break up the meat packers at that time. And at that time, there was 5 of them that controlled that 85%. Now we have 4, and like I said, two of them are foreign owned. So we're in worse shape. That puts more dollars instead of going into our local communities, they went overseas when they made the profits the last few years. We got it, the inputs on tar. We're in a corn. We have a lot of corn here. We have just a few companies that provide all the fertilizer stuff too, and some of it's coming from the Ukraine or the Russia. But the same thing. You just have a few companies that dominate that industry. Tractor, machinery, equipment. It's really all down the line. Chemical companies. That's the.
So safe to say that we have policies in place that are making American farmers less competitive and more reliant on other countries than we should. And I want to go to one more point here, Senator Bach. You've touched on a couple of things, and in your testimony you said that the policies that the administration is pursuing, shutting off mining in Minnesota, yet opening up agreements with other countries for rare earth minerals, it doesn't make sense. Talk to me a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that we are making ourselves less competitive with the policies that we have in place right now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Ferguson. If I could digress for a second, Mr. Chairman, I Googled lakes so that we can kind of get the record straight. And if you believe Google, Alaska has 3 million of them. Wisconsin has 15,000. And if you look at DNR's number, Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota, they say we have 14,380. If you look at how many are 10 acres or more, it drops to 11,842. And then everybody agrees Michigan has 11,000.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Really big.
Thank you, Senator Buck, for straightening that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The problem we're creating is it's one of more than being not competitive. It's one of being incredibly vulnerable. I mean, we only have one very small nickel mine in this whole country, and it's in Michigan. It's the Eagle Mine in Michigan. Other than that, we produce none. And little cobalt, little lithium, these metals that are going to be in tremendous demand. The problem is we leave ourselves incredibly vulnerable. And if I'm China sitting right now and I think we're going to take Taiwan, guess what? They could put a strategy together and take it back, unite it, and there's not much we could do, because all they'd have to do is threaten to cut off our critical metals, and it would bring us to our knees. So whether it's a good idea to take it or not, I just think we're giving these other foreign governments incredible leverage over us by not having our own critical metals that we need for our medical devices, for everything that sustains life. And Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think part of the problem in this country right now is a growing number of people have lost their connection to the land, and they don't know where things come from any longer. And you know, the copper wire and the copper pipe doesn't come from Home Depot or Lowe's. It actually comes out of the ground. And I used to tell my Twin City colleagues, many are good friends, that when you get up in the morning and you put the milk on your kids' cereal, you ask them where the milk came from. And if they say the grocery store, you tell them it came from a cow. And I just think, as we get another generation disconnected from the family farms, kids don't understand where things come from. And I think it's creating a real problem for us and a vulnerability for us going forward.
Well said. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Smucker is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is wonderful to be here to hear this squabble about who has the most lakes. I can tell you, you can drive in Pennsylvania for a long time without seeing any lakes at all. So we're not in that. But I will say this, and I want to address a question or two to Mr. Vald, because what you describe in your background is very similar to the district that I represent, which is Lancaster County and York counties in Pennsylvania. So we are one of the top dairy producers, top 25 at least in the country, have over 5,000, and the size of the farms can really range from small, obviously we're home of the Amish, but have a lot of small family farms, but also some larger farms as well, as you were talking about. But I was very pleased, and I was here in Congress when the USMCA was negotiated, and I was pleased that the negotiators, the administration, the legislature had really made the access to the dairy markets in Canada one of the top priorities. In fact, it sort of held up the final negotiations of the USMCA until that issue was at least supposedly resolved. And then it's particularly disappointing to see what's developed because I do think the USMCA as a whole was very, very good. Created a lot of new markets for a lot of products and opened those markets up to our producers. But on the dairy side, I mean, it's got to be really frustrating to you when you see one of our big partners, Canada, of course, really continue to implement policies that sort of protect their dairy producers, and you don't have access to market. I'm just curious how that makes you feel. I mean, here it's handled. We handle our dairy system is different, I should say, than what you see in Canada, and there's a lot of protection there. And how does that make you feel?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Schmucker. That's a very good point. And I will say this for those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian dairy industry, that they are under a quota system in Canada, and it is a very protected group of individuals to be a part of that dairy industry. So it's frustrating for me when we put the trade agreements together like the USMCA, which you are correct. It was a good agreement. We fought to the end. Dairy was one of the spotlights of that agreement. As a dairy producer, I really felt good about the outcome of that original agreement. But I think as we've gone forward, we're continuing to see some struggles with the enforcement from the Canadian side. So when you're a U.S. dairy producer who has a very different business model than the Canadian dairy industry, where we are relying on trade, moving our product, producing our product at a very efficient level, and we follow the guidelines to be part of the safest food produced in the world. Yes, it is very frustrating for me as a producer because it does create a very unfair playing field because my income, we're talking about input costs, right now I'm producing my milk on my farm far below what my dollars coming in are. So it is a very painful time to be in the dairy industry right now.
And if that continues, you talked a little about the impact on your operation and other farmers in your area. Like, what will be the long-term impact? I wonder if you could expand on that just a little if this doesn't change, if we don't have access to the Canadian market.
Yeah, and so the long-term impacts, again, it's like I stated earlier with the situation in Wisconsin. In the U.S., our business model continues to be go big or go home sometimes, which I find frustrating. The reason we went to automated milking or robots in our facility was to create efficiencies without having to become a very large organization in order for us to compete in this environment. But if this continues, businesses like mine who have been in business for multiple generations are going to cease to exist.
Yeah. I see I'm out of time. My next question, I'd love to hear from you. This is about trade, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about tax policy, particularly tax policy in the tax bill that we passed in the early years of the previous administration. This committee obviously also works on that policy. So at some point, maybe we can have a conversation. I'd love to hear some provisions that you think are important as part of our current tax code. But I guess we'll do that another time because I see I'm out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to come to the Heartland to hear from people who have a lot of important things to say. But I got to admit, being from the Central Coast of California, what my friend Dan Kilding knows what I call the salad bowl of the world, I hear a lot about agriculture. It is our #1 industry there on the Central Coast of California. And, you know, what we have, like I said, is obviously a lot of, you know, we grow it, you name it. A lot of specialty crops is what it comes down to. Now, I admit, with redistricting, I lost some of the salad bowl, but what I lost in lettuce, I gained in wine and steak, which is not bad, in the sense that I have over 400 vintners in my district, and I have the largest cattlemen's association in California, as Kevin Kester will be so proudly tell you. So I'm well aware of these issues. And, you know, obviously from my constituents, obviously from my conventional and organic farmers who I talk to, I support, but also my colleagues, in that, you know, you turn on the TV, you're going to see the differences. I get it. That's what's sexy. That division sells, okay? But you got to realize that there's a lot that you don't see, a lot of bipartisanship that you don't see, where we actually come together and find our similarities. And I can tell you, especially when it comes to agriculture, especially when it comes to the Farm Bill. Now, look, you're going to hear some fights over SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, coming up. I get that. But the fact is, a majority of that Farm Bill is going to be bipartisan. So please know that there are Republicans and Democrats back in Washington, D.C., and many sitting at this table that obviously support you and what you do and want you to continue to tell your message. Continue to tell your message of what agriculture is about, and that you basically demonstrate and represent that attitude that America needs, that pivoting attitude, that risk-taking attitude that I believe is the backbone of this country. So please continue doing what you're doing, knowing that there are members in Washington, D.C. that will continue to support you. Now, obviously, this is a hearing not about the Farm Bill, but about trade and what we can do on ways and means to support you. One of the areas that I've heard quite a bit about on the Central Coast is these non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to sanitary, phytosanitary issues based on non-science basis. You see it in Japan with our vegetables, Mexico with our corn, and UK with our beef. And so, Mr. Scheffelbein, obviously you being the host of this wonderful hearing, I'd like you to expand and elaborate if you've experienced, and how so, these non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to SPS issues.
And you're absolutely dead on. When you get down to what really matters, it's whether or not your beef can get in the channel, right? And you can write all the rules you want, and if they have an exclusion on something that's hard to trace or it doesn't have any data behind it, it's game over. And we've fought with the European Union forever on hormones and the levels of hormones that should be allowed to compete. And when you can have a dish of spinach and get 10 times more risk of hormones than you can a piece of beef, but you can't allow beef in, that's exactly what you're talking about. And we need to be aware of them, and we need to make sure we get rid of all non-tariff type barriers, because they're huge impacts for our business.
In regards to those types of barriers, if you can, part of your experience, what have you seen, and what can we do better to make sure that we get rid of those non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to SPS issues?
Well, as Mr. Scheffelbein mentioned, any kind of barrier is not something that is beneficial for any farmer or rancher in the United States. And that would be the same in our case. We cannot continue to trade fairly and equitably if they have barriers up there that really you can't find a reason for it other than politics. And, you know, we appreciate the bipartisan nature of the Farm Bill, especially, and of trade. So much of what is important in the heartland is nonpartisan, and it needs to remain that way. And it also, we need to communicate that to our trading partners, that we cannot make this political, we need to make this practical.
Market access programs and foreign market development programs, I got a bill to expand those and increase those in the Farm Bill. Can you talk with me briefly about your time dealing with those programs and how beneficial they are?
I assume you're referring to MAP and
MAP
FMD.
And FMD.
Yes, awesome programs. They are, just in a short answer, they are underfunded. there is a big demand for those programs to be funded to move more product into foreign markets.
Great. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Scheffelbein. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know everybody's had a long day. Thank you very, very much. I was sitting here thinking a little while ago that humans or any mammals walking in front of a crowd here in a place like this, I'm very glad that y'all at this point have not auctioned any of us off. I might make some suggestions, but we'll go ahead with that. But first of all, I'll start in a very bipartisan manner. I would like to agree with Ms. Sanchez completely. Our immigration system is broken. I'm very proud to represent Eastern North Carolina. I've got the coast. Anybody ever been to the Outer Banks? I've got that over there. Large number of farms. In fact, we have the second most hogs in any district in the country. And our visa program is broken. We have folks flooding over our borders illegally now. Just think of what we could have legally, the folks that would come in and actually pay taxes, get the farmers' work done, and then go back home. Just imagine what we could do. With that, Ms. Olson, I'd like to ask you, Prop 12, that great California law written by people who had no damn idea what a hog farm or a hog pen looked like. I wonder if you could expound upon that, what that looks like for you, what it's going to cost for you. What is it? In other words, what's it going to do to your facilities right now?
Well, as a contract finisher, it is up to the family that we contract finish for to make those provisions. They already have one sow farm that meets Prop 12 standards, and they did that to hopefully catch a foreign market. But now it also fits in the California market. But that is just one part of their facility. So the rest of the pork, the rest of the barn space, and for finishers like us, it will affect pig flow, and it will affect how many pigs we can have in a barn at a time. So the fewer pigs in a barn, the less the rent check is for us, and the less manure that we will have for our fertility needs. So it's kind of a ripple effect, and our pens are already at a scientific spacing, so we're not overcrowded. The pigs have plenty of room according to science, and that is how the barns were designed.
Right, so I've been through a bunch of hog farms in Eastern North Carolina. Those hogs are huge. Problem is, you give them too much room, guess what happens to the litter? They sit on it and squash the little baby, or if they let them in a pen, what do? They chew each other's tails, they chew each other's ears, and they attack each other. So there is a reason for keeping them closed in. I was very disappointed in the Supreme Court ruling. I think it's interstate commerce being regulated by a state, but it's going to absolutely affect the way my district has to run its hog production business. Quickly, because I'm actually trying to stay on time here, Mr. Bach, just to go back to this mineral issue. We go back to it over and over and over again. We see that we're okay in this country in the almighty pursuit of everything climate change to ignore the abuses going on in other countries, the slave labor, the ravishing of lands, and not do it in this country. And when I spoke with Secretary Kerry about this at COP last summer, being very, very respectful, we talked about those things. I brought up specifically how we're not going to be able to meet our own demand, our own national security, because of what overregulation and the environmentalists are going to do in this country. We're okay to rape and pillage the rest of the world and use slave labor over there, but not in our country. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, thank you.
I got you on 1 minute.
Back to the vulnerability issue. The American military is heavily dependent on nickel.
Absolutely.
And like I said earlier, we produce almost none. So for us to stay strong on the world stage, we have to have a supply of these critical metals. And the fact that we're okay with exploiting other countries around the world, and remember now, in those other countries, use the Republic of Congo, for example, remember those cobalt supplies there where those people are being abused badly are now owned by China. China is buying up mineral deposits all over the world. So we're going to be in an incredibly vulnerable situation if we don't figure out how to develop
with the
these
bellicose
things
nature
ourselves.
that's going on between us and China right now, we are placing ourselves at absolute inferior risk to them by these policies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Kustoff is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coordinating today's hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today, and Mr. Schiffelbein for hosting us. Really is, I think this is special in a way to have the Ways and Means Committee travel here to Minnesota rather than having you have to come to Washington, D.C. First of all, it's a benefit to you all. It's also a benefit to us because we're here, we can see, we can hear, we can talk, and so we appreciate all of you very much. Mr. Schiffelbein, if I can with you, and I want to follow up with Dr. Murphy's question about Prop 12, because you talked about that in your opening statement, in your testimony. We're speaking here to a national audience. This is being broadcast across the nation. Can you first, in your own words, explain Prop 12 to those people across the nation, and then from a real-world perspective, how that could affect you?
Yeah, and for me specifically on hogs, it's not going to affect, but it's the cascading effect that matters. And what it is, it's the government getting involved in areas they simply have no knowledge on. So what happens is activists whose goal, and this is the key thing that most people don't realize, the activist goal is to put us out of business. Okay, plain and simple. It's to put us out of business. So they put wraparound words with animal husbandry, etc., and they try to pass laws, and sometimes they pass propositions that, in essence, put you down a track of going out of business. When we can't fundamentally raise hogs and pork the way we can efficiently do it, it costs us money and we lose the profits on it. So from my perspective, it's a dangerous, dangerous precedent. And if you would go a little deeper into it, you will find the industry was well on its way with a path to get to exactly where they were, only maybe done through a more methodical place that doesn't put a burden on anybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Bold, you talked a lot about, you've been asked a lot about USMCA and Canada and the way Canada has been treating dairy farmers. Can you give maybe some, it's always good for me to hear real-world practical stories. Can you talk about the real-world effects that's had and Canada's compliance or non-compliance with dairy farmers that you know?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, and I'm going to refer back to the Class 7 situation back in 2017 because that's probably the most real-world situation that I have personally seen people's faces on or talked to that were directly involved or affected by that. When you take an industry like my industry or my business and you get that phone call that says your output for your product is done, I can't store anything. I still have to be responsible to the animal welfare of the animals that are on my farm. I have to make sure that they're well fed. I have to do everything in my power to make sure that I don't have a Prop 12 show up in my backyard. So when you see families like this that cannot find a home for their milk, their income stream is done. And like we talked earlier, in the situation we're in right now, especially in the Midwest with a surplus of product, and also running into, we talked a little bit about labor when you have processing plants that aren't able to run all their shifts because they don't have the personnel there to operate it. And when you have truckers that aren't available to move your product a great distance to get it to another market, you are in a world of hurt. And these families, like I said before, when you have been a multi-generational family like mine and your business is potentially done because of something else that a foreign government did to you. And I will stress this, being part of the co-op system, being a part of the co-op system and not part of a private processor, I know that my milk will always find a home because that is the commitment that my co-op has made to me and my family. So thank you.
Mr. Bolt. Thank you again to our 5 witnesses, and I yield back.
Ms. Tinney is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ms. Fishbach and our Minnesota hosts and to all of you, and especially thank you so much to John Schiefelbein and your mom sitting right here by me. It's very exciting to be here. I know, thank you for taking pictures of me and Representative Moore up on a big tractor. She has a connection there. It was fun. I'm going to make you feel a little better, Ms. Moore, because I want to tell you, when everyone's talking about all the lakes, Michigan has the most lakes. I think it's like 36,000 or something. But with waters of the U.S., New York may have the most lakes because we're probably the most left-wing state here. So we are happy that is not going to be coming and rearing its ugly head too much longer. I will say one of the more important things in Wisconsin, and being a former competitive curler, Wisconsin has the most curling clubs in the nation, and I think Minnesota is second. So there you go. So Minnesota does have something distinctive. But I really appreciate all of you for being farmers. Obviously, I talked to Mr. Schiefelbein earlier. My cousin is a beef cattle farmer. My brother's wife's family have Angus, so we really appreciate. We know how hard the work is. They were dairy farmers. They got involved in crops. We know how hard it is. But I also come from the new district created in New York. New York 24 is the largest agricultural district in the Northeast, largest dairy district. Third largest apple producing county in the United States is Wayne County, right in my district, right on the beautiful shores of Lake Ontario. And we have a lot of similarities as we were driving out here. Minnesota looks a lot like New York. We have great soil, great water, short growing season, lots of cold weather, lots of snow. Actually, we probably have more snow than you do. But I want to focus in a little, and I know, Mr. Vold, you've been asked a lot of questions, but dairy is a huge issue for us, obviously. And I feel your pain when that Class 7 dairy was taken out of the USMCA. It was really devastating for New York. And we have a huge border with Canada. My district actually is almost all of the shore of Lake Ontario, which is bordered with Canada. And I was just going to ask you on this issue is now we're in litigation with Canada. Obviously, the U.S. Trade Representative got a big win last year. Do you support potentially having retaliatory tariffs against Canada to enforce this law so that we can get a better trade balance on the dairy products, especially what we lost with Class 7?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I'm going to just say for the record that since I am not a trade negotiator, I won't be able to give you an educated answer to that question. But in terms of what I've stated earlier in this hearing, I still am stand by my comments of being a country that enforces their trade policies. Otherwise, we are going to be directly hurt. So, and I just also want to say that, same with the congressman from Pennsylvania, I actually have a lot of friends part of the Land O'Lakes system in your parts of the world. So I get to hear their perspective on how their regions are affected by oversurplus, lack of markets, and so forth. But I would support some type of retaliatory effort to stabilize our markets.
Okay, so I got one more question. And now that you're robotic with your dairy, I know one of our big issues, and a couple of my colleagues mentioned it, is the labor issue. You said you only had one full-time, 2 part-time in your family. What is your angle on that? And maybe we could ask also the other farm. What is your angle on how do we create more opportunities so that we get more people working on farms? And I'm not sure what minimum wage and some of the things here are in this area. But if you could just maybe quickly comment on that, I have less than a minute left.
That's a great question, and the reason we went to robotics in our family's operation was strictly because of labor. It wasn't that. I think people need to also understand that farms, dairy farms, other ag producers that utilize immigrant labor do not underpay their employees. Our employees all worked 40 hours a week, and they had 15 hours of straight overtime plus housing, and they were very, very competitive in our local market.
Maybe
So-
I could just ask Ms. Olson too, though. I mean, since you're on the dairy side, but or even labor alone, what is the solution that Minnesotans are looking at in terms of dealing with this labor issue?
Well, on our farm, personally, being an organic farm, we need people to hoe weeds. We used to hire high school workers to do that, and they no longer would do that. So we work with families in the state of Texas. They come up for the summer. They hoe weeds for us. I think we employ 18 right now, and I believe their rate right now is $18 an hour for the ones that have returned, and we have a sliding scale for years of experience.
Can I ask one quick question? Do you have unionized labor in Minnesota for farm workers?
Not that we're aware of. I know it's been talked about, but as an independent, not for us.
Thank you so much to everyone. My time's expired.
Thank you. I know there's been a lot of conversation about lakes. And, you know, being from Missouri, I have to talk about the Lake of the Ozarks, which is the only lake that has its own Netflix series. So we're pretty excited about that. From another lake area, Mr. Moore.
Continuing on with the theme, I represent Salt Lake City and the Great Salt Lake, which is the largest saline lake in the United States. So you all can have your freshwater recreation and all that fun. We have brine shrimp and magnesium, so take that. Look, the benefits of sitting on the back bench today and being a little lower on the dais is that most of our very well thought out questions have been answered. I don't want to drill down. I was going to spend actually a little bit of time on dairy. We've covered a lot of these topics. And so to pivot just a little bit, I'm thinking about my conversations I always have with the Farm Bureau of Utah, my ag producers in northern Utah particularly, and it always comes back down to the visa program, labor, and a lot of their frustrations that exist there and things that they would love to see improved. I wanted to just give the panel an opportunity to just start from, let's just go left to right. And if you could, you know, as we approach these trade deals and we try to produce output and make more opportunities for you all, to the extent we're not doing it well is clear today, but we want to make sure that you have the labor that you need. And as we look at improving the visa system for ag workers, what are some of the most important considerations for us to keep in mind? And I'll just leave it open-ended, and would love to start down here with Mr. Schiefelbein, and we'll just keep going down the list.
Well, first of all, at this farm, we don't have a lot of labor shortage because we're those good Catholics, right? So Dad produced his own labor, and actually that's kind of what his goal was. He said he saw that there would be a shortage in labor, and he said, boy, if you don't raise your own, who's going to do this business? So from our perspective, a lot of our family farms are family-oriented, and it's the children that are coming in and doing lots of the work, etc. I wished you guys had a chance to tour through the farm this very day because they were doing square bales, etc., and see the packs of young kids from our farm lifting the bales and putting in the hay, etc. So I still think home-raised labor is still the best labor. Now, on the other point of view, I do think it's important that we have a legal, effective way to get labor in here. And that's where we get into so much trouble. People argue about the make it legal, make it effective, allow people to come in here, and to me, that's the answer.
Ag or other types of workforce, please.
I don't know if we have as much a shortage of labor as we do a skills gap with people. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of jobs, but not with the people with the skill set to perform them. I think states could use more help from the federal government on vocational training. Not everybody needs a college education, but we seem to, for a generation now, been pushing everybody in that direction. So now in places like the building trades and agriculture, I'm sure, we just don't have the bodies that have the skill set that's needed. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, so Minnesota restores its rightful place with the lakes. We have more shoreline in Minnesota than Florida, California, and Hawaii combined.
Ms. Olson.
Thank you, Congressman. For us, I mentioned that we use hired labor from Texas, but in Farm Bureau, we do fight for a renewed H-2A program. It has good intentions, but there's been some issues with it. dairies need year-round labor. Currently, they cannot use the H-2A program. They have to use other programs. So making workers eligible to work year-round with the H-2A program would be really beneficial. But there's also, we had some issues with some of the wage aspects of it. Right now, with the wage rates, a lot of farmers are priced out. They cannot afford to pay the rate that they're required to pay, along with providing housing and providing transportation and the other things that are necessary. So fairness in wages and making that regional, I think, would be helpful.
That's the most common actually I hear from my Utah folks as well. Sir?
Yes, I'm just going to build a little bit off what Carolyn said, and to talk about the dairy industry. Yes, the H-2A program is a little bit of a challenge. They are making changes to that to adapt to the dairy industry. I just want to say I was supportive of the Farm Modernization Employment Act that passed the House last year, because the reality is that we do know that it's no secret in the ag industry there are a lot of illegal immigrants in our countryside doing most of the work on our farms and in our retail and our hospitality areas. We just need an avenue for those people to come out, identify themselves, and become part of our system, because I think they are a huge economic driver of our economy.
Mr. Ritosh, anything to quickly add as we're out of time?
I just want to say, I think one thing that'd be important to the stability in farm income, so the labor that we do have stay on the farm and have a chance to make a living, and obviously reforms to our immigration system and H-2A would all be needed too.
Thank you, Chairman.
Ms. Steele is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Schiffelbein, for hosting, and thank you all the witnesses for today. I think we have seen why the United States and our trusted democratic allies must reduce dependence on the CCP. Americans need to stay at the cutting edge of innovation. We do things safer and cleaner than any other nation. We have learned today that Minnesota stands ready to help supply copper, nickel, and other precious metals. Yet the same people who want everyone to be driving new electric vehicles by 2030 refuse to allow for safe and clean mining within the United States. The administration is putting U.S. and California farmers on the sideline in the Indo-Pacific region. We should build on USMCA's progress by finding additional trading partners that will only grow California jobs and boost our economy. Senator Buck, California's Mountain Pass mine, that is the only large-scale rare earth mine. Almost 15% they're producing 15% of supplies of the world production in the United States. What's alarming is that the minerals are shipped to China. We have spoke a lot on mining today. Can you share more about how United States leading in mining and processing critical minerals would be a huge economic boost for many cities across the country, and how it would be safer and cleaner compared to other mines in the world?
Well, to the labor side of it, I can tell you in northern Minnesota, the highest paying jobs in our entire region are people that work in the mines. Those jobs all support families. But one of the challenges is we've got one of those mines right now that's looking at in the environmental review process, and they already have, they're not even through the environmental review yet, much less mining. They've already made a decision to only mine in Minnesota where the mineral is, and they're going to haul all their product for refining outside of Minnesota because they don't want to have to deal with the environmental end of getting something permitted. If we're going to have investment in this country in mining and refining the metals, we're going to have to be able to streamline this whole environmental review process and create some kind of dashboards, because right now companies don't even know what the timeline is. Is it going to take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years? So they make decisions to potentially mine here, but then move the product offshore to do the refining because it's just too difficult to get through the environmental review and permit the entire process here. So we need help from Washington, D.C. on the regulatory side. I hear some talk about transmission lines, and that's critically important to move the power around the country. But the metal side of it needs some regulatory reform on permitting and regulation.
Thank you, Senator. And Mr. Bold, like Minnesota, California growers send their products all over the world. The United States is currently on the sidelines as many new trade deals are executed in the Indo-Pacific region, an area with huge populations. As the administration tried to sell frameworks over actually true trade agreements, can you share more about how access to new foreign markets could be a huge boost for United States agriculture in places like Minnesota and California?
Thank you, Congresswoman Steele. Actually, I have a lot of dairy friends in California, too, around the Tulare area, and they just discovered their new lake. You know, as far as developing foreign trade agreements with other countries, we got to get to the table. And I think that's one of the points I want to take home today is the fact that we haven't been at the table for a long time. I remember being in Washington a few years ago when we're talking about TPP and TPT and those different trade agreements, and I realize there's a lot of mechanics that go into an agreement with other foreign entities besides agriculture, and those agreements didn't go forward. So again, we just got to get ourselves to the table. We have to become a key player. We have to continue to utilize the programs like we were talking about earlier, the MAP and the FMD, at least to allow our exporters from the U.S. with our products to get their foot in the door of other foreign markets. So
thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Feenstra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am the last person, so they usually leave the best for last. Thank goodness. I just want to tell you where I'm from. I'm from Northwest Iowa. I'm 3 hours away, just straight south of you. Just got a text from my wife, Snapchat, that we have a significant hailstorm moving through. You know, it just tells me that there's things that we can't control, like hail, but there's things that we can control, like trade. And that's stuff that we need to take very seriously. And with that being said, I want to just say I'm so appreciative of Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach and what she does on the Ways and Means Committee. Michelle and I talk an awful lot about what we can do for agriculture, what we can do for trade. She's an amazing person when it comes to advocating on your behalf. I also want to give a shout out to Brad Finstead, who's also in Minnesota, who sits on the Agricultural Committee with me, where we deal with these topics every day. We got the Farm Bill coming up, and we're talking about what we can do in the Farm Bill that also can work with Ways and Means. So with that, in this year's Farm Bill, the Expanding the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Programs, to me, are essential. All right? The administration is letting us down. They're not doing anything. So on the Farm Bill, what can we do with Ways on trade to make a difference? And I'd like to ask Ms. Olson, if you think about farm access programs or farm market development programs, shortly, how can that help you in your, you know, when it comes to corn, soybeans, and these things, how can that help you and promote your product?
Well, in my testimony, I mentioned alcoholic spirits is one thing that we export. That is a unique market, and that is an important part of trade agreements. The market facilitations access is so important, and it's not just your main commodities. It has to be the full picture of American agriculture.
Yep.
And that is where the importance lies.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Olson. Mr. Scheffelbein, I want to say this is the cleanest sale barn I've ever seen. Honest, I've been in a lot. By the way, we just had ours closed in Sioux Center, Iowa, which is tough. And hey, I just want to give you a shout out too. You had a recent tenure on the NCBA board as president, and you had extensive trips. I know you went to UK and Pacific Rim and things like that. Low-hanging fruit, low-hanging fruit. What are a couple countries that you think we could go after right away to create free trade deals with when it comes to cattle?
UK.
UK, yep, bottom line.
They want it desperately, and it just befuddles me why we aren't at that table negotiating.
I agree, and you know what they're doing? They're doing unilateral trade agreements like with Kansas, all right? They're bypassing us as Americans. It's just crazy. Ms. Olson, I'm firing away here. Quick question. When it comes to, when you think about pork, you have 63% of our pork goes to China right now. Shocking. And obviously the rest of it goes to Mexico and a few other countries. But when I get worried about, and we talked about this with African swine fever, that we in the Midwest, it's this little pocket, Iowa, Minnesota, that if African swine fever happens in North Carolina, that we could be pulled into this. And I'm a big proponent of regionalization in our trade agreements. Can you talk about that a little bit, what your thoughts are on regionalization, meaning that we do not get hit with African swine fever, and yet we could get pulled into not being able to trade with anybody because of it?
I totally agree with that. Regionalization is super important, especially when it comes to animal diseases. We saw the same thing with avian influenza. Regionalized response to that saved other turkey producers and allowed them to have a market. Same thing we would like to see apply in the pork industry.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Vold, I can't be remiss to talk about dairy. And I just want to say I'm crushed right now to see milk 100 weight at under $14. All right, it is destroying our dairy industry. It's destroying a lot of my dairy members, and I'm fearful of that. And so with that said, obviously you talked about the Canada falling short. You also talk about the disadvantage we have with Europe and New Zealand and Australia. Can you explain that just a little more for the people that are listening? Why is it so catastrophic right now? And I look at developing countries and say, what can we do when it comes to cold storage? You know, we can send product over there, but they need cold storage to make it all work. Can you explain a little bit a couple of these things?
Well, I'm going to do my best, but again, I'm not an expert in any of those areas. But from a producer perspective, you know, when we start looking at moving product in overseas markets and so forth, I'm going to kind of go back to the two programs we were talking about earlier with the MAP and the FMD. It really allows us to get our foot in the door, especially from the Dairy Export Council side, to start training these people on how to use our products, kind of starting to create that demand for our products. And if we do that in some of the countries I referred to earlier, like Taiwan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and so forth, those are our starting points to start opening up those trade agreements.
Thank you so much. And again, I want to think through, you know, as for dairy specifically, if we can create more cold storage in developing countries, I think we can do a lot more exporting. With that, I yield back. Thank you so much, each one of you, for being here. Thank you for our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank the folks in the audience. I would just love to know, how many farmers do we have in the audience? Just raise your hand. Thank you. Yeah. So I hope that you took the opportunity to fill out the clipboard for anything into public testimony that you would like for the record. I'd like to thank every one of the witnesses for your conversations, for your testimony, for your answers to the questions back and forth to our members. I want to thank every one of our members for being here. It's a priority for this committee to hear from folks outside of Washington, D.C. And this is an avenue for us to do this. And so our priorities are working class families, small businesses, and farmers. And we need to make sure that the policy we develop affects their lives in a positive way. We're here because of Miss Michelle Fischbach, who would not stop encouraging us to come. And so...
Encourage.
Yeah. And we're very grateful. We invited everyone in the Minnesota delegation with the opportunity to join, and very glad with Stauber and Finstad for being here today. And please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal